Have any of you guys ever seen the ABC News show called What Would You Do? Anyone seen this? If you haven't, what they do, they set up scenarios and then hidden cameras because they're going to film how people are responding to different scenarios. For example, if there's a baby left in a hot car, so they'll film people walking by hearing the baby crying to see what do they do. Do they take action? Do they just keep going? What do they do? Or there's an episode, I actually watched an episode of it this week as I had this thought, where a homeless guy is in a restaurant and gets kicked out of the restaurant by the bartender who's serving food. And they're filming the response of people. What do they do? Do they stand up for him? Do they kind of side? Are they quiet? And honestly, watching the episode got me kind of emotional. As I'm watching this, I'm seeing the people who are being rude to the homeless guy. I'm like upset, but then just really moved by those who are really kind and take a stand. And I'm sure they set it up because they want you to get engaged. And that's the name of the show. What would you do? Because the real point isn't always just what were they doing. It's asking the viewer to say, what would you do if you were in this situation? As we get near the end of our journey through the Gospel of Mark, we're entering the final climactic moments of the Gospel of Mark. The portions that are commonly known as the Passion of Jesus Christ, where we witness the emotional suffering that he went through as he is betrayed by friends, as he wrestles in prayer in the Garden of Gethsemane. We see his physical suffering as he is beaten, as he's flogged, and ultimately as he has spikes put through his wrist and his feet as he's nailed to the cross. And we see his spiritual suffering as he takes on the sins of the world, and therefore experiences separation from his Father in heaven. And while there's many ways we could study through this, we could focus in on the historical aspects of it, and there's value to those. We could focus in on the theological aspect of the atonement, and there's value to all of that, and we'll probably have some touches of that as we study this. But what we're going to do over the next 3 Sunday lessons, starting with this morning, so this morning and the next 2 weeks, is we're going to look at how some of the people present reacted to what was going on. And then I'm asking us to try to put ourselves in the garden. Put ourselves at Jesus' arrest, at his trial. Put ourselves at his flogging, at his crucifixion, and ask ourselves, what would you do? The title this morning is What Would You Do? And that'll actually be the title for the next 3 lessons. This morning, we're calling it Episode 1. We're going to look at the followers. We're going to look at a few of the followers of Jesus. And we'll primarily this morning be in the Garden of Gethsemane, leaking some over into his arrest. Next week in Episode 2, we'll look at the authorities. Those who were in charge at the time as we look at the trial, Jesus' trial. And then the 3rd week, we're going to look at the bystanders as he actually goes to the cross, up the Via Dolorosa to the cross, the bystanders who were there. And we're doing this because the reality is that I think we can struggle with some of the same responses we're going to see in these people over the next 3 lessons. And only in Jesus can we find the solution to these struggles. And since Jesus is where we find the solution, we're actually going to start this morning not looking. We'll get to it, but we're going to start not looking at any of the people there, but start by looking at Jesus, start by learning from him as he prepared to go to the cross in the Garden of Gethsemane. So we'll start in verse 32 of Mark chapter 14, if you want to follow along with me here. It says Jesus and his disciples, 11 of them, Judas had already left to betray him at this point, says they went to a place called Gethsemane. And Jesus said to his disciples, "Sit here while I pray." He took Peter, James, and John along with him, and he began to be deeply distressed and troubled. "My soul is overwhelmed with sorrow to the point of death," he said to them. "Stay here and keep watch. Going a little farther, he fell to the ground and prayed that if possible, the hour might pass from him. Abba, Father, he said, everything is possible for you. Take this cup from me, yet not what I will, but what you will. Then he returned to his disciples and found them sleeping. Simon, he said to Peter, are you asleep? Couldn't you keep watch for 1 hour? Watch and pray, so that you will not fall into temptation. The spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak. Once more he went away and prayed the same thing. When he came back, he again found them sleeping because their eyes were heavy. They did not know what to say to him. Returning the third time, he said to them, are you still sleeping and resting? Enough! The hour has come. Look, the Son of Man is delivered into the hands of sinners. Rise, let us go. Here comes my betrayer. You know, the emotional turmoil begins as Jesus is deeply distressed and troubled by what's about to happen. And so we find him honestly expressing his heart to Peter, James, and John. He says, my soul is overwhelmed with sorrow to the point of death. We find him honestly expressing his heart to his Father in heaven in prayer. As he prays, man, God, if it is possible, may this cup of suffering be taken away. You know, just because Jesus knew this was coming, that didn't make this easy for him. You know, Hebrews 5 gives us a bit of insight into what helped guide Jesus faithfully through the most difficult moments of his time here on earth. That guided and enabled him to actually live out those words, not my will, but your will be done. Hebrews 5, verse 7 through 9, we're told that during the days of Jesus' life on earth, he offered up prayers and petitions with fervent cries and tears to the one who could save him from death. And he was heard because of his reverent submission. Son though he was, he learned obedience from what he suffered. And once made perfect, he became the source of eternal salvation for all who obey him. You know, what we see Jesus doing in the Garden of Gethsemane, this passage tells us, wasn't a one-time event. During the days of his life on earth, he wrestled in prayer like we see him wrestling in the Garden of Gethsemane. And a key that we're told here in Hebrews 5 was his view of the one that he's offering these prayers up to. He's praying to the one who could save him from death. And we might go, but wait, he died. Hey, God still saved him from death. He raised him from the dead. He's praying to one that he knows is good enough. He's good. He wants to save, and he's powerful even over death. That's the one he's praying to. He's praying to one who is worthy of reverence. He's heard because of his reverent submission. He's praying to one that he knows he is worthy of reverence. This morning in my quiet time, I'm reading through Psalm 66 this morning. I was told through the psalm to give honor to the one who is worthy of it. This is a common theme, and Jesus did this. He prayed to the one he could trust enough to submit to his will. So he's able to be obedient even when it was hard. He did die. And he suffered before he died. You know, another thing we're told here that's key is how he viewed that suffering. He learned obedience from what he suffered, became perfect, teleos, mature, became what he was sent to earth to become, the eternal source of salvation for all who would believe in him. And so his view of suffering is it was a necessary part of obeying God, a necessary part of him becoming who God had him on earth to be. Suffering was a part of that. You know, when we're looking at the eyewitnesses over the next 3 weeks, we're going to see many failings. when evaluating ourselves, if we choose to do that and say, what would you do? We're going to see failings in ourselves also. There will always be a gap between Jesus and us. As we grow spiritually, the hope is that gap is closed, but there will always be a gap. Don't be discouraged by that. Rather, we need to allow Him to help us close that gap as we grow spiritually, as we learn from Him, as we experience His grace, as we stand in His grace. Learning some things from Jesus in this garden example can help us in this journey to close that gap. We also need to stay open with trusted friends. The Son of God calls Peter, James, and John to Him and says, my soul is overwhelmed with sorrow to the point of death. We need to do that with trusted friends. The Christian life was never meant to be lived alone, solo, trying to figure it out on our own. He brings us into His kingdom with other followers of Jesus, a community of believers. We've got to also be real with our Father in heaven in prayer. The throne we approach, we're told we can approach with confidence because it's a throne of grace. Confidence in Him, not in ourselves. So we've got to also do this. We've got to fight to keep a proper perspective of challenges and suffering in our lives so that we don't lose heart. It is easy to use suffering and challenges as an excuse to disobey God and miss the fact that these help build character and obedience to Him, to make us more and more into the image of Christ. We've got to fight to have a correct view of God. I often don't have a correct view of the one that I'm praying to, coming to. A.W. Tozer had this famous quote. He says, what comes to mind when we think about God is the most important thing about us. And oftentimes we can go through life with very distorted views of God, views of Him that are formed by our experiences or formed by our desires or our sinful tendencies, formed by the culture around us, rather than formed by how He reveals Himself in Scripture. And one of my favorite things to do in going through the Scriptures is to go through and just highlight the places where Scriptures describe who God is, what God does, and how God feels about things. Because all of those things challenge what I can have as distorted views of Him. The Bible is not simply a collection of short stories that teach us moral lessons, although there are moral lessons in the Scriptures. The Bible is a brutally honest narrative of God. A God who is loving and faithful to His people. And a narrative of the perpetual struggle of His people to relate faithfully to Him. And so in the failings of these people we're going to look at over the next 3 lessons, we're likely to see similarities to ourselves, struggling at times to live in reverence of Him, struggling at times to trust enough to submit to His will. Jesus spoke truth to them and to us in the garden when He said, the spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak. Therefore watch and pray. And yet in Jesus' example, we see the goal of how to relate to God with a proper view of Him and of our challenges in life. We're looking at 3 people this morning that were there, that were on the side of Jesus, if you would, followers. The first one is Peter. Right before they went to the garden, back up in verse 27 of chapter 14, Jesus speaking to His disciples says, you will all fall away, for it is written, I will strike the shepherd and the sheep will be scattered. But after I've risen, I will go ahead of you into Galilee. Peter declared, even if all fall away, I will not. Truly I tell you, Jesus answered, today, yes, tonight, before the rooster crows twice, you yourself will disown me 3 times. But Peter insisted emphatically, even if I have to die with you, I will never disown you. And all the others said the same. Jesus knew His disciples were going to fall away that night. Peter claims otherwise. Peter goes so far as to essentially claim, I'm the most loyal of all of us. here. I mean, even if everyone else, not me, Lord, pledges to death if necessary. And of course, Jesus is the one who proves to be right about what happened. I mean, after Jesus is arrested, we're told down in verse 66 that this happens. While Peter was below in the courtyard, one of the servant girls of the high priest came by. When she saw Peter warming himself, she looked closely at him. "You also were with that Nazarene Jesus," she said. But he denied it. "I don't know or understand what you're talking about." That's what he said. Then he goes out into the entryway. When the servant girl saw him there, she said again to those standing around, "This fellow's one of them." Again, he denied it. After a little while, those standing near said to Peter, "Surely you were one of them. You are a Galilean." He began to call down curses and swore to them, "I don't know this man that you're talking about." Immediately the rooster crowed the second time. Then Peter remembered the word Jesus had spoken to him. "Before the rooster crows twice, you will disown me 3 times." And he broke down and wept. Peter failed miserably here. There's no way to candy coat this. Luke's account records that upon Jesus' third denial there, he locks eyes with Jesus across the courtyard. Like their eyes lock. Try to imagine that moment in time. "I'll die with you, Lord," even if everyone else falls away. And then 3 times, "I don't know him," calling out curses, swearing, "I don't know him." Oh, now, eye to eye with Jesus across the courtyard. What a moment in time. I mean, what could have caused Peter to do this? I don't know. I mean, I don't think he was intentionally lying when before the garden he said, "I'll die with you." I think he meant that when he said it. So what caused this? Was it fear? Doubt? Just selfishness? I don't know. I think it's easy to be critical of Peter. It's easy to observe from the outside. It's easy to be the one watching the TV show and get upset at the people who are doing that. But what about when we put ourselves there? What would you do? What would I do? You know, how many times have we said, "I don't know Jesus," by our actions? How many times have we allowed Jesus to be demeaned and say nothing? How many times have our actions not represented him even though we claim to follow him? You know, if we're honest, we can deny Jesus in a lot of different ways. Maybe more often than we like to admit. I know I'm pretty astounded how quickly my heart can drift from loyalty to Jesus. And I love that hymn we sing, "Come Thou Fount," because there's just that line that resonates. Prone to wander. Lord, I feel it. Prone to leave the God I love. You know, while most of us can likely relate to Peter's failings, how about this? Can we relate to his repentance? It didn't end for Peter here. He failed, but look how he starts to respond even here. When he realizes, it says he broke down and wept. Seeing what his sin did to Jesus broke him. And that was a first step toward leading him back to Jesus. To where he experiences John 21, where he experiences mercy and restoration from Jesus following the resurrection. That puts him in Acts 2, standing there preaching to the crowds the gospel of Jesus and calling them to repent and be baptized. That puts him in Acts chapter 4 and 5, willing to be beaten now when he was arrested rather than deny Jesus. That led him ultimately to where he gave his life on a cross a couple of decades later. So can we relate to his repentance? Do we react to our sin, which, yes, we sin? Do we react with godly sorrow? Or have we grown numb toward our sin? Are we as serious about repenting of sin now as we were the first time we encountered Jesus across that proverbial courtyard and realized how our sin hurts him? Perhaps more than any of the eyewitnesses we're going to talk about in this series, for me, I think Peter is the one I most identify with. I pledged loyalty to Jesus even to death almost 31 years ago. That's the pledge that's the pledge I knew I was making when I said Jesus is Lord. Even if I die, Lord. Anywhere, anything. And yet, I've fallen short of that intended loyalty frequently. Sometimes out of fear or cowardice. Sometimes my heart just gets apathetic. Sometimes I'm honestly just outright rebellious. I know what's right and I just don't want to. I have to fight to not grow numb to sin. I have to fight to repent and get back up again. And get back up again. And get back up again. I've got to fight to have a proper view of God. I've got to fight to embrace challenges as necessary to growth in character instead of losing heart. Can you relate to Peter at all? Brokenness and repentance will be a way of life until we die if we're going to remain faithful. And that's good news. Because at the cross, we realize that this continual journey of repentance, it's available because he loves us in spite of our many, many failings. Secondly, here we find Judas in this section. Let's pick up in verse 43 after Jesus has said, "Rise, let us go. Here comes my betrayer." It says, just as he was speaking, Judas, one of the 12, appeared. With him was a crowd armed with swords and clubs, sent from the chief priests, the teachers of law, and the elders. Now the betrayer had arranged a signal with them. "The one I kiss is the man. Arrest him and lead him away under guard." Going at once to Jesus, Judas said, "Rabbi," and kissed him. The men seized Jesus and arrested him. Then one of those standing near drew his sword and struck the servant of the high priest, cutting off his ear. "Am I leading a rebellion," said Jesus, "that you have come out with swords and clubs to capture me? Every day I was with you, teaching in the temple courts, and you did not arrest me. But the scriptures must be fulfilled." Then everyone deserted him and fled. Denying Jesus, deserting Jesus, those are bad. In Judas, we see outright betrayal. Mark even records this decades later as now the betrayer had arranged a signal. That word, betrayer, that carries some weight. A couple of weeks ago, if you were here, we covered Judas quite thoroughly as we looked at what got him to this point of selling out Jesus, him not being open, him not taking correction well, him thinking he knew the right way, all of that. I'm not going to rehash all of those things this morning. But I do want to highlight one aspect of Judas in light of our saying, hey, what would I do? What if I was there present? We do know that many of the Jews of this time believed that the promised Messiah would come to free Israel from their oppressors. Some of Jesus' followers, actually their expectation of Jesus was that he was going to overthrow Rome. We know that Simon the Zealot was a part of the group, the Zealots, an aggressive opponent of Rome he was, but historical accounts seem to, it's somewhat dicey, but I'm going to run with this. It seems that to indicate in some historical documents that Judas actually was also a member of a group of Jewish rebels before he came to follow Jesus, a group of rebels who also hated the dominance of Rome and were determined to see Rome overthrown. This likely could have been one of the things that attracted Judas to Jesus in the first place. This idea that he was that kind of Messiah. This idea that he was the one who had come to liberate the Jews from Roman rule. And if this was his mindset, imagine the disappointment when he starts hearing Jesus talk about, I'm going to die on a cross. Imagine the disappointment when Jesus, all he talks about is a spiritual kingdom in the hearts of men, not a physical kingdom that's going to overthrow all the nations and set Israel free forever. Just imagine the disappointment in that. So then what does Judas do with this? When Jesus' plans didn't fall in line with his hopes, well, he takes matters into his own hands, decides to settle things how he thought best by handing Jesus over to the Jewish leaders who actually still saw Rome as the enemy. What would we have done in his shoes? Well, what do we do when God doesn't do things the way we think they should be done? What do we do when God seems slow in acting? Do we use these disappointments as excuses to disobey him? Do we give up on the ways of God and try the ways of the world? Because, well, it just doesn't seem like God's way is working. Do we try to manipulate God? Hey, God, if you'll just do this one thing for me, I promise I will. This is what Judas chose. And I think it's sometimes at least what we're tempted with, and maybe even choose as well. Now, similar to Peter, though, it didn't have to end here. And we find out in Matthew 27 that Judas actually ultimately sees that this choice was awful, what he did. Judas experienced failure just like Peter, but how he dealt with it was different. Instead of acknowledging how his sin hurt Jesus, he becomes focused on how his sin hurt himself. It's the classic object lesson in godly sorrow versus worldly sorrow. Peter versus Judas. Because Judas, rather than throwing himself on the mercy of Jesus like Peter ultimately ends up doing, Matthew 27 tells us that Judas actually throws himself at the mercy of the worldly leaders. He goes back to them and says, I messed up. And they tell him, that's your concern, we don't care. He could have found mercy at the feet of Jesus. He found rejection at the foot of the world. Ultimately, instead of returning to Jesus and finding grace and restoration, Judas quits. He gives up. And as much as I like to be critical of him, I get tempted to give up and quit. Consider that even Judas could have experienced the hope of the resurrection if he would have persevered through the suffering instead of quitting. If he'd have just waited a couple of more days, he'd have seen that Jesus' words about him raising from the dead were true. Instead, he gave up on all that Jesus had taught him, all that Jesus had shown him. For Judas, failure brought the ultimate hopelessness. For Peter, failure brought fertile ground for hopefulness, a ground made fertile by the love of Jesus shown on the cross and the power shown at the resurrection. What will we do with our failures? Deal with them like Peter or deal with them like Judas? The third person I want to look at amongst the title of followers here this morning is one that's a little more obscure in the passage, and that is Mark. Mark himself, the one who wrote down these accounts that we now read as the Gospel of Mark. In verse 50, when it says, then everyone deserted him and fled, right after it says, a young man wearing nothing but a linen garment was following Jesus. When they seized him, he fled naked, leaving his garment behind. Now, Mark's name is not mentioned there, but most scholars believe that in these couple of verses, Mark is referring to himself. And to not bore you with all of it, in short, the reason they believe this is who else would have known about this young man hiding and thought it important enough to mention his near capture? I mean, he wasn't captured, Why mention this detail? Most scholars believe it's because that was Mark's personal experience with this. Scholars also tend to believe that the home where the upper room was, that they had the Passover meal and celebrated the Lord's Supper that we looked at last week, that upper room was actually in the home of Mark's mom. Mark likely was involved in helping prepare this Passover that Jesus had shared with his disciples. Likely the one who deployed the man with the jar of water as the signal to the disciples of where to go prepare the feast. Mark would have observed this meal, seen Jesus wash the disciples' feet, overheard the dismay when Jesus said one of them would betray him. He would have witnessed Judas leaving the house, followed Jesus to the garden because he ends up in the garden or right outside of it. All of this done secretly at a distance until he's found out and almost arrested as well. So if all those things are true, then there's a few things we can know about Mark at the time of these events. He had contributed. He had helped out. He had given his family's home, some of their resources, some of his energy, a bit of his time. But this reveals he had not given his whole heart and loyalty, at least not on this night. That's all interesting, but again, the question we're asking is, what would we do? What would you do? Can we be like Mark at all? Following Jesus, but at a distance. Giving some of our time and resources, what's comfortable to give, but not really wholehearted. Not fully invested in his mission, in his cause, in his ministry. Are we willing to be on the periphery of Jesus' ministry, observing, but not really willing to do the hard things involved in following Jesus and helping others follow Jesus? As long as everything is comfortable, as long as everything's smooth, man, we're there. But when things get difficult, do we run away like Mark ran away? What would you do? Can any of us relate to Mark at all? As Jesus prepared to head to the cross, we've seen the reaction of some of those closest to him. And the question I'm asking us to ask is, what would we have done that day in their shoes? And the answer lies with what we're doing today, with our knowledge of what Jesus accomplished during that 24-hour period some 2,000 years ago. Can we relate to denying Jesus at times, like Peter did? Can we relate to growing impatient with God and wanting to take matters into our own hands, like Judas? Can we relate to the fear of going all in for Jesus? Can we relate to running away when things get difficult, like Mark? If we say yes to any of those, I told you at the beginning to not be discouraged. This is why. Jesus died on the cross to redeem us from those failings. In the depths of his sacrificial love for us, we find that offer of repentance for the brokenhearted. In the depths of his sacrificial love for us, we find that path back to the wide open arms of a Father in heaven. The Father who can save us from death. The Father who is worthy of our reverence. A Father who we can trust enough to embrace his will over ours. Peter failed, and he was given the gift of repentance. Mark failed. If you don't know, Mark did become an all-in follower of Jesus. He repented. And you know what? Peter failed again after this. Read Galatians 2. And he went to the throne of grace again. Mark failed again after all of this. probably more times than the scriptures record. And because of the love of God, they return to the throne of grace over and over and over and over again. And our life in following Jesus will also be that path of repentance back to the throne of grace over and over and over again. I want to share some lyrics before I close out from a song by Andy Mineo that I think speaks very well to this. Andy Mineo has some deep lyrics sometimes. It's not just I'm coming in hot all the time. So he says, your grace is amazing. Look where you went for me. On them wooden beams, took responsibility for sin that you never did, to call you a friend to me. Your ways are so high, but you bent your knee. I keep falling, but you call me to get on my feet. Keep walking, because what you started, you will complete. I'm going to keep repenting till the day I leave. I'm going to keep repenting till the day I leave. That's what we're offered through the cross. At the cross, on those wooden beams where he took responsibility for our sin, we find the hope to walk this path.